Graham Holloway didn't even look up from his phone when he signed the termination orders. 237 names. He initialed the bottom of the page the way most men sign a dinner check, fast, distracted, already thinking about something else. The bonus he'd authorized for himself that same morning was $4.2 million. The spreadsheet he'd buried inside a shell company in Delaware had been running for 3 years. And the man emptying the trash can 6 feet away from his mahogany desk, the quiet janitor with the calloused hands and the tired eyes, had read every single number. If this story already has your attention, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make these for. Hit that like button, drop your city and country in the comments right now. We love seeing how far these stories travel, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Some of the most jaw-dropping moments are still ahead. Stay with us. The Mopey bucket had a busted wheel. It had been busted for 11 days, and every time Daniel Mercer pushed it down the east corridor of Sterling Dynamics' 42nd floor, it dragged and squealed against the polished concrete like an injured animal. He'd submitted a maintenance request twice. Nobody had responded. So he pushed it anyway, leaning his weight into the handle the way a man leans into most things in his life when the alternative is giving up. Daniel was 41 years old, and he had worked the night cleaning shift at Sterling Dynamics for the past 2 years, 7 months, and, as of that Tuesday, 18 days. He knew the exact count because he'd started the job 10 days after his wife's funeral, and some numbers you just don't stop tracking no matter how much you wish you could. He had a daughter at home, Maya, 9 years old. She was with Mrs. Okafor from downstairs on the nights he worked, and he always left a plate covered in plastic wrap on the second shelf of the refrigerator in case she woke up hungry before he got back. Macaroni, usually. Sometimes rice and chicken. She never complained about the food, which was either a good sign or a sign that she'd already learned not to ask for more than what was available. He didn't think about that too hard. The east corridor on 42 was the executive wing. Daniel had learned its rhythms the way you learn a difficult neighborhood, through patience and close observation. The corner office belonged to Vivian Sterling, the CEO, though she was rarely there past 7. The second largest office belonged to Graham Holloway, Chief Financial Officer, who was almost always there past 9. The man worked late. Daniel had always interpreted that as dedication until about 6 weeks ago, when he started paying closer attention to what exactly Graham Holloway was doing during those long hours. It had started, of all things, with the shredder. Sterling Dynamics had industrial shredders on several floors, large gray machines that sat beside the copy rooms like pieces of furniture nobody thought twice about. Part of Daniel's duties included emptying the shred bins into the large disposal bags that went down to the building's secure waste area. Most nights, the bins were half full of routine paper waste, letterheads, duplicate invoices, old memos. But 6 weeks ago, the shred bin outside the executive suite had been overflowing, packed so densely that the lid wouldn't close. Daniel had needed both hands to compress it enough to lift the bag out, and when he'd hoisted it, the bag had split at the seam. Not dramatically, just a small tear at the bottom, the kind of quiet failure that happens to everything eventually. And roughly 24 shredded strips had spilled across the floor. He'd gotten on his knees to collect them. That was the job. And somewhere in the middle of gathering strips of paper off polished concrete, he'd noticed that several of them had numbers on them. Not random numbers, structured ones, column formatted, the kind you see in financial documents. Daniel had an accounting degree from Ohio State University, class of 2006. He had worked for 8 years as a junior auditor at a regional firm in Columbus before the firm collapsed during a restructuring, before the job market had not been kind, before life had administered its sequence of gut punches and deposited him here, on the 42nd floor of a Chicago high-rise, collecting shredded paper off the floor at 10:30 on a Thursday night. He looked at the strips. He couldn't help it. Some patterns are hard to unsee once your brain is trained to recognize them, and what he saw in those fragments, even torn, even scrambled, were vendor codes, payment amounts, company names. He told himself it was nothing. He tied off the bag, replaced it with a fresh one, moved on to the next bin. But the next night, he'd started paying attention. It took him 3 weeks of careful observation to understand what he was looking at. He never stole documents. He never removed anything from the building. What he did was slower, and in its own way, more dangerous. He remembered. He had always had a strong memory for numbers. It was the thing that had made him a decent auditor once upon a time. And each night on the 42nd floor, he moved through his routine with his eyes open and his mind working. Logs left on printer trays. Memos improperly discarded in recycling instead of the shred bin. A vendor list that sat on a glass-topped meeting table for 2 full nights before someone collected it. The picture that assembled itself in his mind over those weeks was not subtle. A company called Meridian Consulting Solutions appeared on approximately a third of all vendor payments he'd encountered in discarded documents. It had its own payment codes, its own processing priority, its own contact details in the footer of correspondence. What it did not appear to have, based on everything Daniel could reconstruct, was any actual function. No deliverables referenced, no project names attached, no personnel listed beyond a single managing director whose name appeared on exactly one document, a letter of introduction dated 3 years earlier, signed by Graham Holloway himself. There were other companies too. Apex Procurement Services, Bridgewater Logistics Partners, ClearPath Advisory Group. All of them appeared regularly in payment records. None of them left any trace in the business reporting Daniel had quietly been reading during his lunch breaks on his phone. No website, no LinkedIn presence, no news mentions, no registered office addresses that checked out. He had not gone to anyone with this. Not yet. The reason was simple and practical. He was the janitor. He was the man with the busted mop bucket and the maintenance request nobody had answered. He had no documentation, no copies, no proof of anything beyond his own memory and the pattern he'd assembled from fragments. He'd been in enough professional environments to understand exactly what happened when someone like him walked into someone's office with a theory. He thought about it while he worked. He thought about it on the bus home. He thought about it standing over the stove at 6 in the morning while the macaroni softened in the pot and Maya slept in the next room with her arm hanging off the bed the way she always slept. He thought, $64 million. That was the rough figure he'd been able to approximate based on payment volumes and time frames. It could be more. It was probably more. He thought, 237 termination notices. He'd seen that number 2 nights ago, initialed at the bottom by Graham Holloway, sitting in the outbox on the executive assistant's desk. Restructuring, the cover sheet had said. Operational efficiency realignment. Language so bland it was almost offensive, used to describe the end of more than 200 people's livelihoods. He thought about what it meant for those families. He thought about what it meant that the man initialing the termination papers had spent the previous hour on the phone. Daniel had heard him through the partially open office door, voice low, satisfied, discussing the wire routing for a new set of payments. There was a moment, around 11:30 that Tuesday night, when Daniel stopped outside Graham Holloway's office door. The light was still on inside. He could see the shadow of the man at his desk through the frosted glass panel, the posture of someone thoroughly comfortable with what he was doing. Daniel stood there with his mop bucket for 10 seconds. Maybe 15. Long enough that it would have looked strange to anyone watching. Then he pushed the bucket forward and kept moving. I took the 12:45 bus home most nights, which got him to a stop at 1:18 if the connections worked. On nights when they didn't, he walked the last 14 blocks. He didn't mind the walk. Chicago in late autumn had a specific quality to it. The cold coming off the lake, the streets mostly empty, the city compressed and quieter than it ever got during the day. And it gave him time to think in a way that the apartment, with its small sounds and its weight, did not always allow. That night he walked the 14 blocks. He'd made a decision somewhere between the 38th floor and the lobby, though he couldn't have identified the exact moment. The decision had more to do with Maya than with anything else, not in the sense that he was trying to be heroic for her. He wasn't built for that kind of thinking, and besides, heroics were a luxury of people with more options. It was simpler than that. She was 9. She needed things. He needed this job. And at a certain point, knowing what he knew and staying quiet about it started to feel like a different kind of theft, slower and aimed at himself. He needed to find a way to make someone listen to him. That was the problem he turned over on the 14-block walk home. Not the evidence. He knew what the evidence said, not the fraud itself. That part was almost clarifyingly simple. The problem was the same one it had always been. How do you make a room full of people with power take seriously the words of someone they've already decided doesn't matter? He didn't have an answer, but he had the beginning of a thought. The 42nd floor had one particular corner he'd come to use as a reference point, a small alcove beside the east stairwell door where the signal was strong enough to run a basic search, and where nobody ever walked past after 10 o'clock. He'd started spending his smoke breaks there, not smoking. He'd quit 6 years ago, right after Maya was born, but sitting on an overturned bucket with his phone and his thoughts. He'd used those breaks to research the shell companies. What he'd found, or rather what he hadn't found, was methodical and thorough. Meridian Consulting Solutions had a registered address in Delaware that corresponded to a mail forwarding service used by roughly 400 other companies. Apex Procurement Services had a phone number listed in one business registry that went to a voicemail box that had never been set up. Bridgewater Logistics Partners had been registered 3 years ago and had filed no public records since. The pattern was so clean, it almost looked designed to be found, which Daniel understood was its own kind of arrogance. The people who build these structures build them to withstand outside scrutiny, not inside knowledge. From the outside, a forensic accountant would need months and subpoenas. From the inside, with access to enough discarded paper, you could see the skeleton in 2 weeks. He'd written nothing down at work. Instead, each night after his shift, before the bus, he'd sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and reconstructed what he could. The legal pad was stored inside a cereal box at the back of the high cabinet Maya couldn't reach, which was the only secure location he had access to. By the end of week 3, the legal pad had 47 pages of handwritten notes, approximated transaction tables, company names, dates, and cross-references. It was not evidence. It was the record of someone who had been paying attention. The opportunity came from a direction he hadn't expected. It was a Thursday, about a week after he'd seen the termination orders. He was cleaning the executive conference room, the large one, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the 40-person table, when he found a tablet left on one of the chairs. High-end model, expensive case, screen-locked, but logged into a document sharing application that had pushed a notification to the lock screen. He didn't touch the document. He did read the notification preview, which showed the subject line of what appeared to be an internal memo. Q4 Liability Reconciliation, Holloway Final Review, Confidential. He set the tablet on the table where it would be clearly visible and finished his work in the room without touching anything else. On his way out, he noted the name on the visitor badge sitting beside a water glass at the head of the table, which had not yet been collected. A consultant's badge, temporary, 3-day issue. The name was Angela Reeves, senior partner, Crestwood Financial Advisory. He wrote that down on his phone's notes app, deleted it after he'd memorized it, and kept moving. Well, Angela Reeves was not hard to find. She had a professional profile, published articles, a contact form on the Crestwood Financial Advisory website. She was an external forensic accounting consultant who had worked on 3 publicly known corporate fraud investigations in the past decade. She was the kind of person who, if she were already retained by Sterling Dynamics, might already be looking for exactly what Daniel had found. Or she might not know what she was looking for yet. In which case, she might be willing to receive a very specific, very carefully worded anonymous tip through a very ordinary email address. He'd thought about this for 2 days before he did it. He'd thought about what to say, and how to say it, and how much to include. He'd thought about what happened if Graham Holloway found out, which meant thinking about what happened to his job, which meant thinking about Maya and Mrs. Okafor and the cereal box in the high cabinet. Then he thought about 237 names. He typed the email from a public library terminal 3 miles from his apartment, using an address he'd created for the purpose. He spent 40 minutes on it. When he was done, it was precise and short. 6 paragraphs, specific enough to be credible, careful enough to give away nothing about who he was or where the information came from. He asked for nothing in return. He didn't identify himself. He listed 5 company names, 3 specific payment amounts with approximate dates, and 1 particular document reference he'd reconstructed from memory, a routing memo that he believed linked Graham Holloway's personal authorization to a Meridian Consulting Solutions wire transfer. He sent it at 11:23 in the morning, in the middle of a Tuesday. Han took the bus home and made grilled cheese sandwiches because it was Maya's half day at school, and she always wanted grilled cheese on half days. She ate hers at the kitchen table while reading a book about horses, which was a phase she'd been in for 4 months, and didn't ask him why he looked tired. He was always tired. She'd stopped asking about it a long time ago, and that was somehow both the easiest and hardest thing about her. "Dad," she said, without looking up from the book, Yeah. Mrs. Okafor said you work really hard. He turned the second sandwich in the pan. Mrs. Okafor is a smart woman. She said you're like a machine. Maya looked up. I told her machines don't make grilled cheese. He smiled, and it was a real one, which was something. You're right, machines can't do this. They could probably do grilled cheese, she said, turning back to her book. They just don't. He put the sandwich on her plate and sat down across from her and didn't say anything else for a few minutes. The apartment was quiet. Outside, someone was backing a truck out of the alley, and it was taking a long time. The cheese was slightly overdone on one side. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Most important moments weren't. That night, back on the 42nd floor, Daniel pushed his busted mop bucket down the east corridor and noticed that the light in Angela Reeves' temporary office, the small conference room that had been assigned to the Crestwood team, was still on at 11:15. Through the narrow window beside the door, he could see her at the table. She had 3 monitors open and a legal pad of her own on the table beside her, and she was writing with the focused, slightly tense posture of someone who has just found something they weren't entirely expecting to find. Daniel kept walking. He didn't slow down. He didn't look a second time. But something in his chest, something that had been clenched and quiet for 6 weeks, shifted very slightly. Not relief. Not yet. More like the first faint indication that a door you've been pushing against might actually have given it. He pushed the mop bucket to the end of the corridor, turned the corner, and kept working. Angela Reeves had not slept well in 4 days. This was not unusual for her during an active engagement. She'd always been the kind of person whose brain refused to power down when there was an open question sitting on the table. But this particular sleeplessness had a different quality to it. It wasn't the restless, circling kind that came from too much coffee and not enough answers. It was the specific, electric insomnia of someone who has found something real and is still working out exactly how bad it is. She'd received the anonymous email on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, she'd confirmed 3 of the 5 company names through public registry searches. By Friday evening, she'd found the 4th. The 5th, Meridian Consulting Solutions, had taken her until Sunday because whoever had set it up had been careful. Multiple layers of registered agents, a Delaware address that traced back through 2 intermediary LLCs before finally dissolving into what appeared to be a private trust structured in the Cayman Islands. That last part was what had kept her up. Amateur fraud used 1 shell. Competent fraud used 2. What she was looking at had used 5, layered over 3 years, with payment routing that changed quarterly in a pattern. She was fairly certain had been designed to avoid automated flagging thresholds. This wasn't opportunistic. This had been planned before the first dollar moved. She was sitting in the temporary office they'd assigned to the Crestwood team. Small room, no windows, 2 folding tables pushed together. When her colleague Marcus knocked and came in without waiting, which was his habit, and one of the things she tolerated about him because he was otherwise good at his job. "Tell me you've got something," he said, dropping into the chair across from her. "I've got a lot of somethings." She turned one of her monitors so he could see. "Look at the payment volume to Meridian over the past 36 months. Marcus leaned in. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a consulting retainer." "No. That's a river." "More like a drainage system," she said. "Consistent, regular, structured to look like operating expenses. But there are no deliverables attached to any of these payments in the records we've been given access to. Not a single project report. Not a scope of work. Nothing." Marcus sat back. "Could be misfiled. 412 payments over 3 years with 0 documentation? That's not misfiling. That's architecture." He was quiet again. That was the thing about Marcus. He pushed back, but when the evidence was solid, he stopped pushing. Holloway's the CFO. Nothing at this scale moves without his authorization. His signature is on 37 of the primary routing memos. She pulled up a scanned document on the second monitor. Right there. That's not a forgery. I've compared it to authenticated signatures from board filings. That's his actual hand. "How did you find the routing memos?" "The records we were given access to don't include—" "We were given access to the primary accounting system. The routing memos were in a secondary archive that whoever set up our permissions apparently forgot about." She paused. "Or didn't think we'd look." Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Someone tipped you, didn't they?" She didn't answer right away. The anonymous email was still in a separate air-gapped account she'd set up specifically for it. She hadn't accessed it from any Sterling Dynamics network, hadn't discussed it with anyone yet, hadn't entirely decided what to do about its existence. In her profession, anonymous tips were either the most valuable thing you could receive or a deliberate misdirection, and you couldn't always tell which until you'd followed them far enough down. This one had been followed far enough. "Someone pointed me in a direction," she said finally. "The evidence pointed itself from there." Marcus studied her. He'd known her for 6 years. He knew when she was being precise and when she was being evasive, and he also knew, after 6 years, that there was usually a good reason. "Okay," he said. "So what do we do?" "We document everything we have right now, tonight, in a format that can't be altered. Then tomorrow morning, we request a meeting with the board's audit committee chair. Not Holloway, obviously, and not anyone who reports to him. And we present what we have. That's going to blow the engagement wide open. It's already blown wide open. We're just the ones who know it yet." He stood up, looked at the monitors for another moment. "Angela, how much are we talking?" She'd been running the calculations for 2 days, cross-referencing payment amounts against the shell company structures she'd mapped. The number had kept climbing as she found more layers. "Conservative estimate," she said. 64 million, possibly significantly more, depending on what's in the archives we haven't been cleared for." Marcus didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, the way people nod when the number is large enough that it needs a moment to become real. "Go home," she said. "Get some sleep. Be back here at 7. He left. She turned back to her monitors. Outside in the corridor, she heard the faint squeal of a mop bucket wheel. Daniel had noticed the change on the 42nd floor 2 days after he'd sent the email. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying the right kind of attention, but the right kind of attention was something Daniel had been developing for 3 years in environments where people didn't think he was watching. The Crestwood team had arrived 3 weeks earlier as what everyone described as a routine external audit, but starting Wednesday of last week, their hours had changed. Later arrivals. Much later departures. The temporary office that had been dark by 8 most evenings now had light under the door past midnight. He didn't know what they'd found. He didn't know if his email had anything to do with what they were finding. But the activity had shifted, and shifts meant something was moving. What made him uneasy was a different shift, Graham Holloway's behavior. The CFO had always been a particular type of executive, the kind who performed confidence rather than felt it, who spoke a little too clearly and moved a little too deliberately, as if he'd studied how powerful men were supposed to carry themselves and had been practicing ever since. Daniel had cleaned around him for nearly 3 years and had come to read him the way you learn to read weather. The ordinary Graham Holloway was controlled and smooth. The Graham Holloway of the past week was something else. He was arriving earlier, leaving later, taking phone calls in the stairwell instead of his office, a choice that suggested he didn't want to be overheard through the door, but which failed to account for the fact that the east stairwell was part of Daniel's cleaning route and had no ambient noise to mask a conversation. Daniel had not made it his business to listen. But sound moved in stairwells the way it moved in few other places, clean and unobstructed, and voices carried whether you wanted them to or not. What he'd caught were fragments. A name repeated twice, Ferris, a phrase he'd had to reconstruct from context. The timeline has to move up. And one sentence, clear enough that he hadn't needed to reconstruct anything, spoken by Holloway in a voice stripped of the performance he usually maintained. "I need those files consolidated before end of month. If Reeves gets into the secondary archive, everything falls apart." Daniel had kept moving up the stairs. His feet hadn't slowed. His expression hadn't changed. He'd learned over years of being invisible in rooms where things happened that the moment you react to something you weren't supposed to hear is the moment you stop being invisible. But once he was 3 flights up and alone, he'd stopped and stood still for a moment with his hand on the railing. If Reeves gets into the secondary archive. She hadn't gotten there yet. Or Holloway believed she hadn't, which meant there was something in that archive, something significant enough that its discovery would, in Holloway's own words, make everything fall apart. Daniel had 2 problems. The first was that he had no way of knowing how much time he had before Holloway moved to consolidate or destroy whatever was in that archive. The second was that he still had no way of communicating with Angela Reeves that didn't risk identifying himself or invalidating the careful, untraceable approach he'd taken so far. He turned both problems over for the rest of his shift. By the time he was on the bus home at 12:53 in the morning, he'd worked out a partial answer to the second problem. Whether it was a good answer was harder to say. The building's internal directory was accessible from any workstation using a general staff login, which Daniel had been issued on his first day and had never needed to use for anything more complex than submitting maintenance requests. He accessed it from a terminal in the basement break room at 11:05 the following Tuesday, during the 30-minute window when the room was reliably empty. He was not looking for Angela Reeves' direct contact information. He already had her professional email from the Crestwood website. What he was looking for was the access log for the secondary archive system, which, according to a help documentation page he'd found buried in the staff intranet, was managed through a separate filing system with its own permission tiers. He found it. More precisely, he found that the access permission request form for the secondary archive required a departmental authorization code, and that the form itself listed the authorizing personnel for each department. For financial records, the CFO, one of two deputy CFOs, or, in cases of audit-related access, the board's audit committee chair. The audit committee chair was a woman named Patricia Huang. Her contact information was listed. Daniel didn't access anything he wasn't authorized to access. He read a form, noted a name, and logged out. Then he went back to work. That night, from the same public library terminal he'd used before, he sent a second email. This one was not to Angela Reeves. It was to Patricia Huang, Board Audit Committee Chair, and it was very short. The external audit team should request access to the secondary financial archive before end of this week. There is a reason this access has not been offered to them. The person with the most to lose from that access being granted is already aware that the audit team is getting close. He is moving to limit what they can find. I cannot tell you who I am, but I can tell you that what I know is firsthand, and that the window is closing. He sent it at 7:48 in the evening. He was home by 9. Maya was already asleep, which meant the day had been good enough that she hadn't needed to wait up, or bad enough that she'd run out of energy before he got there. He checked her room. She was on her back with both arms at her sides like she was floating, the horse book open face down on her chest. He put the book on the nightstand. He turned off the lamp. In the kitchen, he sat for a while with a glass of water and didn't think about anything specific. There was a particular kind of tired that settled in after you'd done something you couldn't undo, and it wasn't unpleasant exactly, more like the fatigue that comes after something that required everything you had. He'd sent 2 anonymous emails to 2 different people with institutional power, told them enough to act on, and given them no way to find him. It was either going to work or it wasn't. Patricia Huang called an emergency audit committee session on Thursday morning. Daniel didn't know this until Friday, when he overheard Graham Holloway's executive assistant, a brisk, efficient woman named Sandra, who had always been professionally pleasant to Daniel in the way some people are pleasant to service workers, which is to say, warm on the surface and fundamentally unreflective underneath. Take a phone call at her desk with the particular tight quality in her voice that meant she was managing something unexpected. "Mr. Holloway is in meetings all morning," Sandra said. "I can pass along the message, but I can't guarantee—" A pause. "I understand. I'll let him know the committee has requested his presence at 2 o'clock. Another pause, shorter. "Yes. I'll tell him it's mandatory." She hung up. A moment later, she picked the phone back up and dialed an internal extension. Daniel was on the far end of the corridor, returning his equipment cart to the supply closet, and he kept his pace exactly even. He didn't hear what Sandra said to Holloway. He didn't need to. A mandatory emergency meeting called by the audit committee, 2 days after Daniel had sent his email to Patricia Huang. The timeline was moving. What Daniel had not anticipated, because there are always things you don't anticipate, regardless of how carefully you plan, was that Graham Holloway would spend the 40 minutes between Sandra's call and his scheduled meeting doing something that changed the entire situation. Daniel found out about it not through observation, but through the building's mundane physical reality, specifically through the supply closet on 42, which shared a ventilation duct with the server access room 3 doors down. The server access room was where the company's internal document management system was physically housed. Backup drives, local archive terminals, the secondary filing system Daniel had researched. It was a room Daniel serviced twice a week. He had, in the course of those cleanings, become unconsciously familiar with its sounds, the hum of the drives, the occasional click of a terminal being used. What he heard on Friday afternoon, 15 minutes before Holloway was due in front of the audit committee. Different. Not a terminal being used casually, a sequence of rapid inputs, commands being entered fast with the particular rhythm of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was doing it under pressure. Daniel set down what he was carrying very quietly. He stood still. The sound continued for about 4 minutes, then stopped, then started again briefly. Another set of rapid inputs, shorter this time. Then silence. Then footsteps, quick, purposeful, moving away from the server room toward the elevator bank. Daniel counted to 15 before moving. He walked to the server room door, which was shut but not latched. Whoever had left had not pulled it fully closed, and pushed it open with his shoulder in the way he always entered rooms. Cart first. Presence minimized. The room looked the same. Drives humming, lights on. Nothing visibly disturbed. But on the local terminal, which had gone to its screensaver, the small indicator light that showed active archive access was still blinking. It blinked for about 30 seconds after active use before going dark. Daniel had never had reason to pay attention to that detail before. I was paying attention to it now. It had been active within the last minute. The archive had been accessed. He didn't touch the terminal. He cleaned the room, replaced the waste bin liner, and left. On his way to the elevator, he passed Sandra's desk. She was gathering her things to leave for the day, which was unusual. It was only 1:40, and she looked the way people look when they've been told something that hasn't quite resolved into a clear emotion yet. "Good afternoon," Daniel said. "Afternoon," she said, without really looking up. He pressed the elevator button. Waited. "Did they cancel the meeting?" he asked. He kept his voice flat. Curious the way a person makes small talk. Sandra looked up, looked at him. "Sorry?" "I heard the elevator earlier. Sounded like a lot of people coming and going." It was thin. He knew it was thin. But people who are processing something unexpected are often surprisingly willing to talk to someone they've already categorized as unthreatening. "Mr. Holloway left early," she said. "Not the whole story. A corner of it. There's a situation with the systems." "Building maintenance thing?" Daniel asked. "I honestly don't know." She looked back at her desk. "Have a good night." "You too." He rode the elevator down and walked through the lobby and pushed through the revolving door into the cold. A situation with the systems. He walked 2 blocks before stopping at a payphone. There were almost none left in the city, but this one had survived, bolted to the side of a parking structure, and he'd clocked it 6 months ago for no reason he'd understood at the time. He used it now. He called the main Crestwood Financial Advisory number, which he'd memorized from the website. "Crestwood Financial, how can I direct your call?" "Angela Reeves," he said. "May I ask who's calling?" "I'd rather not say. Please tell her it's the person who sent her an email 3 weeks ago. She'll know." A pause. 1 moment. 40 seconds, maybe 50. Then a click. "This is Angela Reeves." Her voice was controlled, but not entirely. There was something underneath it. Not panic, more like the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for a shoe to drop and just heard it. "You found the archive," Daniel said. A beat. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been watching this longer than you have." "Are you in the building right now?" "Yes." "Then you need to get to the secondary archive terminal before the end of today. I think it was accessed in the last hour by someone who was not authorized to be there. I can't tell you what was done to it, but I think you need to find out." "How do you know it?" "I know because I was in the supply room next door 15 minutes ago." He stopped himself. That was more than he'd meant to give. "The access indicator on the terminal was still active when I walked in. That's all I can tell you." Silence on her end. The sound of her thinking. "You're in the building," she said. "I was. I'm not now." "Your staff." He didn't answer. "You've been watching this from inside," she said. It wasn't a question. "The email you sent, the routing memo reference, that's not something you find through a public source. That's something you see." "Get to the terminal," Daniel said. "Please." He hung up. He stood beside the payphone for a moment with his hand still on the receiver, which was cold and smelled like rust and old plastic. The street was ordinary around him. foot traffic, a delivery truck double parked, a woman arguing with someone on her phone about something that had nothing to do with any of this. He thought about what he'd just done. He'd told her enough. Maybe too much. Maybe exactly enough. There was no clean way to know. He walked to the bus stop and waited. Angela Reeves reached the secondary archive terminal at 2:17 in the afternoon. She'd had to get Patricia Huang to authorize emergency access on the spot, a conversation that had happened in the hallway outside the audit committee meeting room and had taken 8 minutes that felt considerably longer. The terminal showed a deletion log. Someone had initiated a batch deletion of approximately 340 documents from the secondary financial archive, routing memos, payment authorizations, correspondence, at 1:34 that afternoon. The batch deletion had been interrupted. Not completed. Interrupted. The system's auto-backup protocol ran on a 15-minute cycle. The deletion had been initiated at 1:34 and interrupted. By what? The log didn't specify, but the timing suggested the auto-backup had triggered at 1:45 and created a conflict that halted the deletion queue at 1:46. Approximately 40% of the targeted documents had been deleted. 60% remained, including. Angela would spend the next 4 hours confirming this, cross-referencing with the document index she'd already mapped. All 37 of Graham Holloway's signed routing memos authorizing payments to shell companies. All 37 were intact. She sat at the terminal for a long time after she understood what had happened. Then she pulled out her phone and called Patricia Huang. The archive was tampered with, she said. Someone tried to delete records this afternoon. They didn't finish. We need to freeze the system, preserve everything that's there, and you need to call your legal team right now. Who did it? The access log shows an authorization code. She read it off. I don't have the personnel directory in front of me, but I'm fairly certain whose code that is. Patricia Huang was quiet for a moment. Can you prove it? I can prove the deletion was attempted. The code is in the log, and I have 37 signed documents that tell a very clear story about where $64 million went. She paused. That's the conservative number. I want to be clear about that. Another silence. Longer. Miss Reeves, Patricia Huang said finally, I need you to stay in that room and not let anyone else access that terminal. I'm going to make some calls. Angela looked at the screen, at the deletion log, at the 37 intact documents sitting in a directory that someone had very nearly made disappear. I'll be here, she said. Outside the door, the 42nd floor was quiet. The executive wing was mostly empty, the late afternoon light cutting across the corridor at a low angle, the kind that made everything look briefly clean and simple, which was a quality the light had that the situation entirely lacked. Somewhere in the building, or possibly already gone from it, Graham Holloway was a man who had walked out of the server room believing he'd finished what he came to do. That belief was going to last, Daniel estimated, and Angela Reeves was reaching the same calculation from her end, until someone corrected it, which would happen soon. The only question now was exactly how much damage a man could do in the time between believing he'd gotten away with something and finding out that he hadn't. Part 3. The Billionaire Faces Betrayal. Patricia Huang did not sleep that Friday night either, though for reasons different from Angela Reeves. Angela's sleeplessness was the kind that came from work unfinished. There were still document sets to cross-reference, still layers of the shell company structure she hadn't fully mapped, still the nagging awareness that 64 million was a floor, not a ceiling. Patricia's sleeplessness was older and more complicated. She had known Graham Holloway for 11 years. She had voted to approve his compensation package 4 times. She had sat across from him at board dinners and listened to him talk about fiduciary responsibility with the particular fluency of someone who understood the concept so thoroughly he'd built an entire fraud around its language. She lay in her bedroom in Lincoln Park and stared at the ceiling and thought about what it meant that she hadn't seen it. By 6 in the morning, she'd given up on sleep, made coffee, and called her attorney. By 8, she'd called Vivian Sterling. Vivian Sterling had built Sterling Dynamics from a regional data analytics firm into a company with 4,200 employees and operations in 11 states, and she had done it over 23 years through a combination of genuine vision and the kind of relentless attention to detail that most people who hadn't worked directly with her tended to underestimate. She was 61 years old. She'd had the same assistant for 14 years. She still read every significant contract personally before signing, and she had trusted Graham Holloway with the financial architecture of everything she'd built because he had been, for a decade and a half, apparently worth trusting. That was the part that was going to be hardest to process. Not the money. The money was serious, and the money mattered, but money could be recovered. What couldn't be easily recovered was the specific kind of trust you extend to someone you've worked alongside long enough that you've stopped questioning their presence. The trust that had become so habitual it had stopped being trust and had just become assumption. She took Patricia's call in the kitchen of her Gold Coast house, standing up because she rarely sat during difficult calls. She listened without interrupting. When Patricia was finished, Vivian was quiet for about 4 seconds. "How confident is she?" Vivian asked. "Angela Reeves has done this for 20 years. She's not speculative. When she says 64 million, she means she can prove 64 million. And the archive? Frozen as of yesterday afternoon. Legal has a preservation order in place. Whatever was in there when Reeves accessed it is locked." Another silence. Vivian set her coffee mug down on the counter. The sound was very quiet and very deliberate. He tried to delete it. "The log is clear. While he was supposed to be walking into your meeting. He never came to the meeting. Sandra told the committee he'd had an unexpected conflict." Vivian absorbed this. "I want to see everything she has. All of it. Today." "I thought you might. I've asked Angela to put together a briefing package. She can be at your office by noon." "Not my office." Vivian said it without hesitating. "If Graham is monitoring internal activity, and if he's been doing this for 3 years, he almost certainly has systems in place that flag unusual meetings, then I don't want him to know we're meeting until I've decided exactly how to proceed. Somewhere neutral, not connected to Sterling dynamics." Patricia considered. "My firm's conference room. We can have it cleared." "Noon," Vivian said. She hung up and stood in her kitchen for a while longer. Out the window, the lake was gray and flat under an overcast sky, which was what the lake looked like most of November, and it had never bothered her before. But it bothered her now in a way she didn't entirely have language for. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with Graham, which had been 2 days ago. He'd stopped by her office at the end of the day, the way he occasionally did. Nothing formal, just the collegial check-in that had been part of their rhythm for years. He'd mentioned the Crestwood audit in passing. Going well, routine stuff, should wrap up in the next few weeks. He'd been relaxed. She'd been distracted by something on her desk and had only half listened. She thought about what it took to hold a conversation like that. To sit across from the person you were stealing from and perform ease that convincingly. Either it was sociopathy or it was practice. After 11 years, she supposed it could be both. The noon meeting at Patricia Huang's firm lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Angela Reeves presented systematically the shell companies, the payment flows, the signed routing memos, the 3-year timeline, the structural choices that had been made to avoid automated detection. She had printed materials, and she walked through them page by page because she'd found over the years that presenting financial fraud to non-accountants required slowing down at exactly the moments you were tempted to move quickly, the moments when the numbers got large, the moments when the pattern became undeniable. Those were the moments people needed to sit inside for a minute. Vivian Sterling sat across the table and worked through every page. She asked questions, good ones, specific ones, the kind that told Angela she was not just absorbing information, but actively looking for holes, testing the evidence the way you'd want the other side to test it before you committed to a course of action. When they reached the routing memos, Vivian stopped. She picked up the page. Graham Holloway's signature, 37 times across 37 documents, authorizing payments to companies that did not exist. She'd seen his signature on so many things over the years, contracts, approvals, board materials, that she knew it the way you know a familiar handwriting, the slant of it, the particular way he crossed the second letter of his last name. She set the page down. "Who else knows?" she asked. "At this point," Angela said, "you, Patricia, myself, my colleague Marcus, and your legal team. I've kept the circle very tight." "Does Graham know that the deletion failed?" "Not unless someone told him. The system didn't generate an error notification. The interruption was passive, not flagged. From his perspective, he may believe the documents are gone." Vivian let that sit for a moment. "So he may believe he's already solved his problem." "That's my assessment, yes." which means he hasn't done anything further to cover his tracks because he thinks there are no tracks left. Angela nodded. It's a narrow window. Once he realizes the deletion was incomplete, and he will realize it eventually, the calculus changes. He might attempt something else, or he might try to establish distance by resigning under a pretext. Either way, the window closes. Vivian looked at Patricia. We need to move carefully. If we act too quickly and make a procedural mistake, the legal case gets complicated. If we wait too long, we don't wait, Vivian said. Not loud, just clear. We do this right, but we do not wait. I want a silent forensic audit running by Monday. I want law enforcement contacted through channels that don't touch anything inside the company. And I want Graham Holloway in the building, at his desk, acting as if everything is normal, for as long as it takes to complete what we need to complete. Keeping him in the building means keeping him from knowing, Patricia said. Yes. That's difficult if he's... I know it's difficult. Vivian looked at her attorney. I also know that the alternative is watching him move money out of Cayman accounts from an airport lounge somewhere that doesn't have an extradition treaty. She paused. I've been in business long enough to know what people do when they think they're about to get caught. The ones who are smart enough to build something like this are also smart enough to have an exit strategy. The room was quiet. There's something else, Angela said. She'd been saving this. Not because it was the most important piece of evidence, it wasn't, but because it changed the shape of the story in a way she thought Vivian needed to hear. The anonymous source, the person who tipped me. Vivian looked at her. You don't know who it is? Not by name, but based on the phone call I received yesterday, the one that told me to get to the archive before the end of the day. I know enough to make a reasonable inference. She chose her words carefully. This person has been inside the building. They've had access to discarded documents from the executive floor. They understood what they were looking at well enough to reconstruct a picture of the fraud from fragments. And they had the professional background to understand the significance of what they'd found. A staff member. A staff member who specifically has not been given access to any of this at any stage, who sent the initial tip anonymously and has asked for nothing. Vivian considered this. Can you reach them? Not directly. They've contacted me twice, and both times through untraceable methods. Angela paused. I think they're being careful because they're not sure they'll be believed, or because they're worried about what happens to their job if they are. Something shifted in Vivian Sterling's expression. Not softness exactly. She was not a soft person, and she'd not built what she'd built by being soft. But something that might have been recognition. The specific recognition of someone who understood, from long experience, the cost of being in a position where you couldn't afford to be wrong. Find them, she said quietly. When this is over, find them. Daniel knew none of the specifics of that Saturday meeting. What he knew, when he arrived for his Tuesday shift, was that the 42nd floor felt different in a way he couldn't have precisely articulated but could absolutely feel. The Crestwood team's temporary office had a new lock on the door. A digital one, recently installed, still with the installation sticker partially peeled off the back panel. The server room had a similar upgrade, plus a notice taped to the door that read, Access Restricted, Facilities Management, in the neutral, administrative language that meant something had changed but wasn't announcing why. Graham Holloway's executive assistant, Sandra, was at her desk with the particular focused blankness of someone who has been told to act normal and is working very hard at it. Holloway himself was in his office. Light on, door closed, which was his default, except that through the glass panel Daniel could see him at his desk in a posture he hadn't seen before. Very still, turned slightly away from the monitors, the way a man sits when he's thinking and the thinking isn't going well. Daniel ran his route. He was good at his route, had always been good at it, the systematic, unremarkable quality of it that allowed him to be present in spaces without registering as present. He emptied bins, replaced liners, cleaned surfaces, moved on. He did not vary his pace or his pattern. He did not look at Graham Holloway's office door any longer than he looked at any other door. But he was listening. At 10:47, the phone in Holloway's office rang. Daniel was in the copy room adjacent to the executive suite, close enough to hear the phone through the wall, if not what was said on it. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, there was a silence, then the specific sound of a desk drawer being opened and closed several times in quick succession. the restless, searching movement of someone processing something unpleasant. At 11:15, Holloway came out of his office. He was dressed the way he was always dressed. Expensive suit, no tie, the cultivated casualness of the executive class. But his face had the quality of a mask that is being held in place with more effort than usual. He walked to Sandra's desk. Daniel was at the far end of the corridor, back turned, attending to a supply cart. "Has anyone from legal been up here today?" Holloway asked. "Not that I've seen," Sandra said. "Patricia Huang. Has she called?" "No." A pause. "If anyone from the board office or the legal team asks to schedule something, I want to know before you confirm it. Don't put anything on the calendar without checking with me first." "Of course," Sandra said. Footsteps back toward the office, the door closing. Daniel stood with his hand on the supply cart and did not move for approximately 5 seconds. Then he moved. He wasn't certain what had changed in Holloway's understanding of the situation. But something had. The man he'd observed for 3 years, controlled, practiced, confident in his own invisibility, was now a man checking his perimeter, which meant his perimeter had been disturbed, which meant something from the weekend had reached him, or nearly reached him, or he'd gone back to verify the archive deletion and found what Angela Reeves had found first. Any of those possibilities meant the timeline was compressing. Daniel thought about the cereal box in the high cabinet at home. 47 pages of handwritten notes, transaction tables, company names, dates. The only detailed physical record of what he'd observed over 3 years, written in his own hand, sitting in his daughter's kitchen. He'd been treating it as a backup, as something he'd eventually use if he needed to. But if the situation was moving faster than he'd calculated, then eventually was no longer a useful concept. He needed to get that information to Angela Reeves before anything else happened. The difficulty was that Angela Reeves was now operating inside a circle he didn't have direct access to. She was coordinating with the board, with legal, with Vivian Sterling herself, a fact he'd been able to infer from the activity on the floor without knowing its specifics. Reaching her through the Crestwood main line and asking to be patched through anonymously a second time was possible, but it was also a second tug on a thread that was getting shorter. Every contact he made increased the chance of being identified. He thought about this on the bus home on Tuesday night, and he thought about it while he made breakfast Wednesday morning. Eggs, because the macaroni situation had gotten monotonous and he'd found a carton on sale. And he thought about it while Maya sat across from him doing the homework she hadn't finished the night before, which was a math worksheet she'd been avoiding because she'd told him math worksheets were depressing, which was a word she'd picked up from somewhere and deployed in contexts that were sometimes accurate and sometimes genuinely funny. "This one's wrong," he said, looking over her shoulder. "I know. You want to try it again or just move past it? Move past it. You can't move past it. It's the third one." She erased it with unnecessary force. "Fine." He watched her work through it. She had her mother's handwriting, the particular way she made her sevens with the little horizontal bar across the middle, a habit he'd never developed, but which he'd loved on her mother and now loved on her. He didn't think about that too much either. "Dad," she said, still working. "Yeah. You seem like you're figuring something out." He looked at her. She was 9. She was also, in the way of certain children who've spent a lot of time around adults who weren't performing happiness, remarkably observant. "I'm just thinking about work," he said. "You think about work a lot." "Most people do." "Mrs. Okafor says you think about work even when you're home." "Mrs. Okafor should think about her own business," he said, without heat. Maya smiled without looking up. "She means it nice." "I know she does." He was quiet for a moment, then, "There's something at work that's complicated. I figured something out, something that matters, and I'm trying to work out the right way to hand it off to someone who can do something with it." Maya looked up at him. She had the evaluating expression she sometimes got. Not judgment exactly, more like genuine assessment, the way a child looks at an adult when the adult is being direct with them and they're deciding how seriously to take it. "Is it going to get you in trouble?" "I don't think so." "Do you know so?" He picked up her worksheet and set it in front of her. "Do question 4, he said. She did question 4. But the question she'd asked stayed with him for the rest of the day, because it was the right question and he'd answered it dishonestly, which he didn't like doing. The honest answer was, he didn't know. He'd been careful. He'd been methodical. He'd never taken anything, never accessed anything he wasn't authorized to access, never identified himself. Everything he'd done was defensible. But defensible and safe were not the same thing. And if Graham Holloway was the kind of man Daniel now believed him to be, patient, systematic, capable of sustaining a fraud for 3 years without detection, then he was also the kind of man who, when backed into a corner, would look for the source of the threat very carefully. And the source of the threat was someone who had been on the 42nd floor, night after night, for the better part of 3 years. Daniel took the 47 pages out of the cereal box that afternoon and put them in his work bag. Mimod his decision in the elevator up to 42 that night. It wasn't dramatic. Decisions rarely are, in his experience. They just arrive, usually after a long time of circling, and then they're simply there. He was going to put the notes in Angela Reeves' hands tonight. Not mailed, not emailed, physically, because physical documents in the right person's possession were harder to intercept and harder to dismiss than anything transmitted electronically. He was going to slide them under the door of the Crestwood team's temporary office in an envelope with her name on it, which was arguably the most dramatic thing he'd done since starting this, and which was also, he felt, necessary. He had an envelope in his supply cart. He'd had it there for a week, the way you sometimes prepare for a decision before you've consciously made it. He wrote her name on the front in block letters, tucked the 47 pages inside, sealed it. He ran his full route first. He was not going to do this hurriedly. He was going to do his job completely, correctly, and then on his way back down the corridor, he was going to stop at the Crestwood office door. It took him until 11:40. The corridor was empty. The executive wing was dark. The only light was the ambient glow from the elevator bank and the steady red indicator on the server room door. He stopped in front of the Crestwood office. The new digital lock was on the door, but the gap at the bottom was the standard 1/4 inch. More than enough. He crouched, holding the envelope. "You can just knock." He went completely still. The voice had come from inside. He hadn't seen the light because it was the desk lamp angled away from the door, and in the dark of the corridor, the gap underneath hadn't shown anything. A pause. Then, "I'm not going to open the door if you don't want me to, but you can knock, and I'll open it, or you can slide it under and walk away. Either works." Angela Reeves. Her voice was very calm, which Daniel understood was its own kind of tension. The studied calm of someone who had thought about what they would say if this moment came and was now trying to say it exactly right. He stood up. He knocked twice. The door opened. Angela Reeves was on the other side of it, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, wearing a blazer she'd clearly had on for about 16 hours, with a coffee cup on the desk behind her that was the 3rd or 4th of the day by the look of it. She looked at him, at his uniform, at the envelope in his hand, at his face. She didn't say anything for a moment. He held out the envelope. "Everything I reconstructed from what I found on this floor over the past 3 years. Transaction tables, company names, payment amounts, dates. It's handwritten, so you'll need to cross-reference everything, but it cross-references. I made sure of that." She took it. "I never removed anything from the building," he said. "Everything in there comes from documents that were discarded or improperly disposed of. Nothing was taken that wasn't headed for the shredder or the recycling." "I believe you," she said. He wasn't sure he'd expected that. "Okay. What's your name?" A beat. He'd thought about this too, about whether to say it. "Daniel Mercer." She nodded. "How long have you been here?" "Almost 3 years." She looked at the envelope in her hand, at the thickness of it. "And you put this together from discarded documents." "I have an accounting degree," he said. "Ohio State, 2006. I worked as an auditor for 8 years before—" He stopped. "Before things changed." She looked at him for a moment in the way people look at something they're recalibrating their understanding of, which Daniel was accustomed to and which he had never quite gotten used to. "Daniel," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "All right. Why didn't you come to Vivian Sterling directly, or the board? Why do it this way?" It was a fair question. He'd expected it. "Because I'm the janitor," he said. "Because I walk in with a mop bucket and a theory about your CFO and 47 pages of handwritten notes, and I'm in that office for approximately 40 seconds before someone calls security. That's not pessimism. That's an accurate read of how those rooms work." Angela was quiet for a moment. "And now?" Now you have the 47 pages, he said. And presumably you're already in those rooms, so it works out the same, just slower. She almost, not quite. I need you to be available. If this goes where I think it's going, and it's going to go there fast, there's going to be a point where the people who need to understand what you saw are going to need to hear it from you directly, not the notes, you. He thought about Maya and Mrs. Okafor, about the maintenance requests nobody answered, about the bus at 12:45 and the 14-block walk and the grilled cheese on half days. All right, he said. Are you worried about your job? I'm worried about my daughter, he said. My job is a means to that end. She nodded slowly, like she was registering the weight of it. I understand. I'll do what I can to make sure this doesn't come back on you in any way that... I'm not asking you to protect me, he said. It came out a little sharper than he'd intended. I'm asking you to use what I gave you correctly. That's all. She looked at him for another moment. I will. He picked up his supply cart. Have a good night. Daniel? He stopped. Vivian Sterling asked me to find you, after this is over. She paused. I think she already understands that the person who started this isn't who she expected. He didn't respond to that. There wasn't a response that felt honest and also comfortable, so he said nothing. He pushed his cart to the elevator, pressed the button. Rode down in the particular silence of a building at midnight, which was a silence that had its own texture, the hum of systems maintaining themselves, the small sounds of an institution that didn't sleep even when everyone in it had gone home. He walked to his bus stop. It was cold enough now that his breath showed. He thought about what he'd handed over. 3 years of attention, 47 pages, his name, things that couldn't be taken back. He stood at the stop and looked at the city and thought about whether he'd made a mistake and couldn't find one, which was either because there wasn't one or because he was too close to see it. The bus was 4 minutes late. He rode it home in the dark, in the specific suspension of a man who has done everything he can do and is now waiting for the world to do its part. Angela Reeves spent the better part of Wednesday night cross-referencing Daniel's handwritten notes against the documents she'd already pulled from the secondary archive, and by 3 in the morning she had confirmed what she'd suspected the moment she felt the weight of that envelope. He hadn't missed anything. That was the thing that kept stopping her as she worked through the 47 pages. Not the volume of it, though the volume was remarkable. Not the accuracy, though the accuracy was nearly perfect. Transaction amounts matching archive records within rounding margins, dates aligning, company names exact. What stopped her was the precision of the analytical framework, the way he'd organized the cross-references, the way he'd built the payment flow diagrams from fragments, the logic of the reconstruction visible in the margin notes he'd written to himself, small annotations in the tight handwriting of someone who'd learned to think on paper and never lost the habit. This was not the work of someone who'd stumbled onto something and gotten lucky. This was the work of a trained auditor who had spent 3 years doing his job while doing another job alongside it, and who had done both with the same quiet, methodical care. She wrote DM notes, fully corroborated across the top of the first page and added it to the evidence binder. By 4 in the morning, she'd drafted the supplemental report. By 6, she'd sent it to Patricia Huang's secure email with a cover note that read, "The source is credible, the corroboration is complete, and I think you need to know who he is before this moves to the next stage." She attached a single paragraph about Daniel Mercer. His name, his role, his background, the fact that he'd approached everything through anonymous channels until the previous night. She did not editorialize. The paragraph said what it said and let it sit. Then she closed her laptop, lay down on the small couch in the corner of the temporary office, and slept for 2 hours. Patricia Huang called Vivian Sterling at 7:15. Vivian was already at her desk. She'd been there since 6, which was not unusual for her during a normal week and was essentially mandatory during a week like this one. She'd been going through the briefing materials from the weekend meeting again, not because she hadn't absorbed them the first time, but because she was the kind of person who needed to turn something over until she'd found every edge of it. She listened to Patricia read Angela's paragraph about Daniel Mercer. She didn't interrupt. When Patricia finished, there was a pause. "A janitor," Vivian said. "A janitor with an accounting degree who spent 3 years reconstructing a $64 million fraud from discarded documents on your executive floor." Another pause. Longer. He never came forward. He couldn't. He understood that without corroboration, he had nothing anyone would act on. So he built the corroboration first and then found the right channel. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She was looking at something on her desk. Patricia couldn't see it, but she could tell from the quality of the silence that Vivian had fixed on something. He protected the company without the company ever knowing he was doing it. For 3 years, while emptying trash cans on the 42nd floor. Yes, the silence this time was different. Not processing silence, decision silence. Patricia had known Vivian long enough to recognize the distinction. "I want to meet him," Vivian said, "before any of this goes public, before the arrests, before the press, before anything. I want to sit in a room with this man. I'll arrange it." And Patricia, Vivian's voice was even, which with her meant something was landing in the exact place that hurt. "Pull the maintenance request logs for the cleaning staff on 42. I want to know what he submitted and what never got answered." Patricia wrote it down. "I'll have it by end of day." "Thank you." A pause. "How close are we?" Legal is coordinating with federal authorities as of yesterday afternoon. The Financial Crimes Unit has been briefed on the archive evidence. Angela's supplemental report adds the last piece they needed for the threshold. Conservatively, we're looking at a warrant within the next 48 hours. And Graham? As far as we can tell, he's still operating under the assumption that the archive deletion was successful. He came in yesterday, attended 2 scheduled meetings, had lunch with his deputy CFO. Normal behavior. Normal behavior, Vivian said, with a flatness that made the phrase sound like what it was. The performance of a man who didn't yet know his audience had left the theater. "We need him to stay calm for another 48 hours, Patricia said. "If something spooks him before the warrant comes through." "Nothing will spook him," Vivian said. "I'll make sure of it." She called Graham Holloway herself at 9 o'clock that morning. Sitting at her desk in her office on 42, with the late gray outside the window and the phone in her hand, she called the man who had been stealing from her for 3 years, and she did it with the specific discipline of someone who understood that the most important performance of her professional life was the next 4 minutes. He picked up on the second ring. "Vivian, good morning." "Good morning." She kept her voice at its usual register. Not warm exactly, never artificially warm, but the collegial directness that had always characterized them. "I wanted to check in about the Crestwood audit. Patricia mentioned it's running a little longer than expected." A very brief pause. Almost imperceptible. "Thorough process," he said. "Reeves runs a detailed team. I'd rather have it done right than fast." "Agreed. I just want to make sure we're not letting it drag into Q1 planning season. Can you give me a read on where they are?" "I'd say another 2, maybe 3 weeks. They're deep in the secondary archive right now, which takes time. But I don't anticipate any significant findings. Routine stuff." The secondary archive. He'd said it casually, comfortably, the way you say the name of a thing you believe is no longer a threat. Vivian absorbed it without any change in her voice. "Good. Let's plan a debrief for end of month then. Your office or mine?" "Either works. I'll have Sandra coordinate." "Perfect." She paused just long enough to be natural. "How are you, Graham? You've seemed a little stretched lately." Another pause, this one slightly longer. "End of fiscal year. You know how it goes." "I do. Don't let it grind you down." She said it with the light, habitual warmth that years of professional relationship produces, and that means almost nothing, and is, in this specific case, the most precisely calibrated thing she has ever said to him. "Have a good day." "You too." She hung up. She sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she opened her email and sent Patricia Huang a single line. "He thinks the archive is clean. We have our 48 hours." Daniel was not told any of this. He arrived for his Thursday shift with his supply cart and his busted mop bucket. Maintenance had still not fixed the wheel, which struck him now as almost funny in the way things do when you've passed beyond a certain point of caring about them, and ran his route the way he always ran it. The 42nd floor looked the same, felt the same, or nearly. Holloway's office was lit, door closed. Sandra was at her desk. The Crestwood team's temporary office had its new lock and its closed door and its air of concentrated activity. What was different was subtle enough that Daniel almost missed it, and he didn't miss things easily. There were 2 men in the lobby when he'd come in. Not security, not building staff, dressed in the particular unremarkable way of people who are trying to look like they belong somewhere without drawing attention to the fact that they're trying. They'd been talking to each other near the security desk, and one of them had glanced at the elevator bank with the practiced non-directness of professional observation. Daniel had filed it, said nothing, rode the elevator up. He thought about it while he worked. Federal agents doing pre-warrant surveillance had a specific quality to them, which he knew from his years as an auditor when his firm had been involved in several cases that had gone that direction. The patience. The apparent idleness that wasn't idleness at all. He'd seen it before. He recognized it. He thought 48 hours was probably optimistic. Could be sooner. He thought about whether he should feel something more than what he was feeling, which was a kind of steady tiredness mixed with the particular alertness of a situation still unresolved. He'd expected at some point during this process to feel something cleaner. Righteous, maybe, or vindicated, or at least relieved. What he actually felt was more like the awareness of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time and hasn't yet been able to put it down. He was on the north corridor, outside the storage room, when Sandra appeared at the end of the hall. "Mr. Mercer." She said it differently than she usually said it. Not cold. Sandra was never cold, but careful. Like she'd been given a message to deliver and was working out the exact phrasing. "Ms. Sterling would like to see you, when you have a moment." He kept his face still. "Ms. Sterling." Yes, her office. She said, "Whenever you're ready. No rush." He looked at his cart. He looked back at Sandra. "All right," he said. "Give me 5 minutes to secure the cart." He took 4. He wasn't going to rush. He wasn't going to perform anxiousness or eagerness or gratitude or any of the things that the situation might have been expected to produce in him. He was going to walk to Vivian Sterling's office the same way he walked everywhere, steadily, without hurry. He knocked on the frame of the open door. Vivian Sterling looked up from her desk. She was smaller than he'd expected. He'd seen her from a distance plenty of times, but proximity and distance produce different impressions. With close-cropped silver hair and the direct, assessing gaze of someone who'd learned early that looking at things clearly was less expensive than looking at them wishfully. She was maybe 60, maybe older, the kind of face that had gotten more interesting as it aged. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "please come in. Close the door." He came in. He closed the door. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, and he sat in it, which was the first time in nearly 3 years on the 42nd floor that he'd sat in anything other than an overturned bucket or a bus seat. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. He let her. "I've been told what you did," she said. "I've read the notes you gave to Angela Reeves. I've seen the corroboration." She stopped. "I don't know quite how to begin this conversation." "You don't have to begin it any particular way," he said. "No, I suppose I don't." She leaned back slightly. "How long did you know before you did anything?" "About 3 weeks before I sent the first email. I needed to be sure enough that it was worth the risk." "And you never considered coming to me directly?" "I considered it." He was honest about this. "I decided against it." Because you'd trusted Graham Holloway for a decade and a half. That's a significant counterweight to an anonymous tip from the night cleaning crew." He paused. "I needed someone else to find the evidence independently first. Someone with the standing to make you look at it." She was quiet for a moment. Something in her expression moved, but she didn't look away. "You're right," she said. "That's an accurate read of how I would have responded." She said it without apology, which he respected. It would have been easy to say she'd have listened, that she wasn't that kind of person. Easier and false. "I'm asking you to understand how much I regret that." "I don't need you to regret it," he said. "It's just how things work." "Maybe." She looked at her desk for a moment. "I pulled the maintenance request logs for your floor, the mop bucket wheel." He didn't say anything. "You submitted that request twice, November 3rd and November 19th. Neither one was actioned." She looked up. "I'm sorry. That's a small thing in the context of everything, but it's the kind of small thing that tells you a lot about whether a place deserves what you did for it." He hadn't expected that. The mop bucket specifically. He genuinely hadn't expected that. Something in his chest did something brief and complicated that he didn't try to name. "It was just a wheel," he said. "Yes, but it was your wheel to deal with every night." She studied him. Angela tells me you have an accounting background. 8 years as a junior auditor before the firm closed. And then? He thought about how to compress the years between Ohio State and this office into something honest and brief. And then a lot of things. My wife got sick. I had a daughter. Work got unsteady. By the time I needed something stable, this was what was available. He paused. It's not a complicated story. It's not a simple one either, she said. He didn't argue. She opened a folder on her desk. Not looking at it, she'd clearly already looked at it, but placing her hand on it, the gesture of someone acknowledging what something represents. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly without thinking about what the appropriate answer is. All right. Why did you do it? Not how. I understand how. Why? He thought about it. The real answer, not the tidy one. Because I was going to know, he said finally. Whatever happened, whether anyone listened, whether it worked, whether I kept my job or lost it, I was going to know that I saw it and walked past it, and I couldn't figure out a way to live with that particular piece of knowledge. He paused. Also the 237 names. I saw the termination list. Those are real people. She was very still. He was going to blame the layoffs on financial performance, Daniel continued. Make it look like the company needed to cut costs. While the reason the company needed to cut costs was sitting in a Cayman Islands account. He stopped himself. Sorry. You know all of this. Don't apologize, she said, quietly. I need to hear it said out loud. The office was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, Chicago did what Chicago did. Traffic, gray sky. The lake somewhere beyond the buildings going about its enormous, indifferent business. The warrant will come through within the next 24 hours, Vivian said. Federal financial crimes. When it does, this floor is going to become a very different place very quickly. I want you to know that before it happens. She paused. I also want you to know that your position here is secure, regardless of how any of this unfolds. I appreciate that. I'm telling you as a fact, not a favor. She said it precisely. What you did was professional work. It deserves professional acknowledgement, and it will get it. But that conversation is for another time. She closed the folder. For now, is there anything you need? Anything that would make the next 24 hours easier? He thought about Maya, about Mrs. Okafor, about the maintenance request and the cereal box and the 14-block walk. He thought about all the ways the next day might go wrong despite everything they'd done right. No, he said. I'm all right. She nodded. He stood. She stood too, which he hadn't expected. She came around the desk, not for a handshake exactly, just the movement of someone who didn't want the conversation to end at a distance. Mr. Mercer. She stopped a few feet from him. Thank you. He held her gaze. Fix the mop bucket, he said. For a moment she looked startled. Then something crossed her face that was, against all the weight of the situation, close to a genuine smile. First thing tomorrow, she said. He left. He went back to his cart. He ran the rest of his route. The warrant came through on Friday at 11:40 in the morning. Daniel was not on the floor when it happened. His shift was nights, and he was home, asleep, when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize that said only, It's Angela. It's happening now. He sat up in bed. Maya was at school. The apartment was quiet. He looked at the message for a moment, then put the phone face down on the nightstand and lay back. He stared at the ceiling for a while. What was happening at that moment on the 42nd floor of Sterling Dynamics? 4 federal agents and 2 officers from the Financial Crimes Unit of the Chicago Field Office had come through the lobby with a warrant that covered Graham Holloway, 2 of his deputies, and a finance manager named Curtis Ferris, the name Daniel had heard in the stairwell, finally attached to a face and a function. Ferris had been managing the shell company payment routing from the inside, the operational link between Holloway's authorization and the accounts that received the funds. What was happening, specifically, at 11:47? Graham Holloway was being escorted from his office in the presence of his attorney, who had been called approximately 9 minutes earlier and had not arrived in time to advise him not to say anything, which meant that the first thing Graham Holloway said when the agents identified themselves was, "There must be some misunderstanding," which was the thing people almost always said first, and which was almost never useful to them. Sandra, according to what Angela would tell Daniel later, had gone very pale and very still, and had sat at her desk without moving for several minutes after they took him out. Not out of sympathy for Holloway. Sandra was not that kind of loyal. More the specific shock of having been, without knowing it, the outer wall of something she hadn't had a word for. At 12:15, Vivian Sterling sent a company-wide email. It was not long. It did not use the word fraud or the word arrest or any of the words that would come later in the press coverage. It said that an internal investigation had identified financial irregularities and that the company was cooperating fully with federal authorities, that the executive team was committed to transparency, and that there would be a full company briefing on Monday morning. It said that the previously announced restructuring was on hold, pending a complete financial review. 237 people did not, on that Friday, receive the termination notices that had been initialed in October and never sent. That was not in the email. It happened anyway. Daniel picked Maya up from school at 3:15. She came through the door in the particular explosive way she came through most doors, backpack half open, talking before she'd fully cleared the threshold about something that had happened at lunch involving a misunderstanding about whose sandwich was whose, which had apparently been more dramatic than it sounds. He listened. He asked the right questions. He did not tell her anything about what had happened that day. On the walk home, she ran ahead to the corner the way she always did, the way he'd told her 100 times not to, and then waited for him with the slightly theatrical patience of a child who knows the rules and is demonstrating that she's following them. "You seem different," she said when he caught up. "Different how?" "Less like you're figuring something out." She looked at him with the sidelong assessment she'd been doing since she was about 6. "Did you figure it out?" "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "The work thing?" "The work thing." She considered this. Is it good or bad? He thought about the warrant, about Sandra's face, about Vivian Sterling saying fix the mop bucket with the weight of everything she'd just learned still sitting on her shoulders, about 237 names that were still just names and not notices. "It's good," he said. "Mostly good." "Mostly?" "Nothing's all one thing," he said. She made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal. The sound of a 9-year-old absorbing a piece of adult information and filing it in the place where she kept things she'd think about later. They walked the rest of the block in the comfortable silence that had always been one of the better things about being with her, the way silence between them had never needed to be filled. At the door to the building, she said without preamble, "Can we have grilled cheese?" "We had grilled cheese 3 days ago." "I know." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the transparent hope of a child who knows the answer might be yes. "Sure," he said. "Grilled cheese." The weekend was quiet. Daniel cleaned the apartment, did the laundry, fixed the loose hinge on the bathroom cabinet that had been loose since August. He did not watch the news, though by Saturday morning the story had started appearing, first as a brief financial crimes item, then as something larger as the details began to emerge. Sterling Dynamics CFO arrested in $64 million fraud scheme. He saw the headline on his phone once, scrolled past it, put his phone in his pocket. Angela texted twice. Once to tell him the recovery process had begun, that federal accounts had been frozen and asset recovery was underway. Once to ask if he was available Monday morning for a meeting at the company. He texted back, "Yes." He didn't sleep well Saturday night. That surprised him. He'd have expected relief to produce sleep, but instead he lay in the dark with the particular restlessness of someone waiting for a version of normal that hadn't arrived yet. Too much had changed too fast, even if most of the changes were good, even if the outcome was everything he'd wanted it to be. Change, in his experience, didn't feel clean just because it pointed in the right direction. Sunday morning he made pancakes, which he was not good at but which Maya loved unconditionally, accepting burnt edges and uneven shapes with the generosity of someone for whom the gesture matters more than the execution. They ate at the kitchen table and she talked about the horse book. She was on a third one now, a different series, and he listened and drank his coffee and thought about nothing specific, which was the first time in months he'd been able to think about nothing specific. And it was harder than it sounded because the habit of vigilance does not switch off easily once you've lived inside it long enough. "Dad," Maya said. "Yeah." "Is everything going to be okay? Like, for real okay, not just okay? You're saying to not worry, me, okay." He looked at her. She had syrup on her chin and the horse book open beside her plate, and the specific directness of a child who has decided that she is old enough to hear the real answer. Yeah, he said. For real, okay. She studied him for a moment, with those eyes that were her mother's in shape and her own in everything else. Then she went back to her book. He finished his coffee. Outside, the city was doing its Sunday thing. Slower, a little softer, the light at a different angle than the rest of the week. The loose hinge on the bathroom cabinet was fixed. The laundry was done. The pancakes were imperfect in the specific way all things worth doing are imperfect. He thought about Monday, about the meeting Angela had mentioned, about what it meant to walk through that lobby knowing what he knew, being who he now was in that building. Not different exactly, but no longer invisible in the same way. The invisibility had always been a choice as much as a circumstance. He'd used it deliberately, carefully, for a purpose that had turned out to matter. He didn't know what came after that. He had ideas, and the ideas were complicated, and he was going to let them stay complicated for at least a few more hours before he had to do anything about them. Maya turned a page. He put his mug in the sink and stood at the window for a while, looking at nothing in particular, which was its own kind of rest. Monday morning arrived the way important mornings sometimes do. Ordinary on the surface, the city doing nothing different, the bus running on its usual schedule, the cold coming off the lake at the same angle it always came off the lake in November. Daniel wore the same jacket he always wore. He carried the same bag. He rode the same route. What was different was that he was going in at 9 in the morning instead of 9 at night, which meant the city looked entirely unlike what he was used to. Full of itself, loud, rushed, people moving with the particular forward-leaning urgency of a Monday that had somewhere to be. He stood on the bus and watched it, and felt briefly like a visitor in a place he'd lived for years, which was not an entirely comfortable feeling, but was at least an honest one. Angela had texted the night before with a room number and a time. Conference room B, 9th floor, 9:30. She hadn't said who would be there. He hadn't asked. He arrived at the building at 9:15. The lobby security guard, a man named Ron who had worked the morning desk for at least as long as Daniel had worked nights, and who had always greeted him with the same two-word exchange every evening, looked up when Daniel came through the revolving door and registered something that wasn't quite surprise but was in the neighborhood of it. "Morning," Ron said. "Morning," Daniel said. He signed in. Ron handed him a visitor badge, which was a strange experience. He'd had a staff badge for nearly 3 years, had never needed a visitor badge, but his staff credentials were keyed to the night system and apparently hadn't been updated yet. He clipped the visitor badge to his jacket and rode the elevator up, which was full of people he didn't recognize, which was how it always was during the day. The 42nd floor was not his destination this morning. The 9th floor was administrative, legal, HR, some of the internal finance functions that weren't in the executive suite. Conference room B was at the end of a short corridor, and its glass wall showed a table with several people already seated around it. He stopped outside for a moment, not hesitating exactly, just taking a breath. Angela Reeves saw him through the glass and stood. That was the signal. He opened the door. The room had 6 people in it. Angela he knew. Patricia Huang he recognized from the board profiles he'd found during his research. The 2 men in dark suits with the particular stillness of federal law enforcement he'd seen in the lobby Friday. One of them gave a brief nod that acknowledged they'd been in the same building at the same time without acknowledging anything else. A woman from the legal team whose name he'd learned was Carol Devereaux. And at the head of the table, Vivian Sterling. She looked different in the daytime in a meeting room full of people than she had across her own desk on a quiet floor. Not smaller, if anything, more present, the kind of person who takes up more space in a room than their physical dimensions would suggest. She was wearing a dark blazer and no jewelry except small earrings, and she was looking at Daniel when he came in with the same direct, assessing gaze she'd turned on him Thursday night. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "thank you for coming." He sat in the empty chair they'd left near the middle of the table. Not at the head, not at the foot. In the middle, which felt right. "I'll keep the formal part brief," Vivian said, looking around the table, "because most of you already know what we're here to discuss. For the record and for Mr. Mercer's benefit, the federal warrant executed. Friday resulted in the arrest of Graham Holloway, Curtis Ferris, and 2 external associates connected to the shell company network. Asset freezes are in place across all 5 entities identified in Angela's report. The recovery process is underway, and the initial estimate puts recoverable funds at approximately $58 million, with the remainder subject to ongoing tracing. One of the federal agents, the one who hadn't nodded, said, "We expect additional recoveries as the offshore structures are unwound. The Cayman accounts alone are estimated at 12 to 15 million. The key issue for this morning," Angela said, opening a folder, "is establishing the formal record of how the investigation developed. For the federal case, for the company's own documentation, and because the source of the initial disclosure has certain rights and protections that need to be formalized." She looked at Daniel. He looked back at her. "Mr. Mercer," the federal agent said, "we'd like to walk through your account of events, beginning from when you first identified the discrepancies. We'll record this as a formal voluntary statement. You have the right to have an attorney present if you choose. The company has offered to provide counsel at no cost." "I don't need one," Daniel said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. I didn't do anything wrong." He said it without defensiveness, just the flat factual quality of a statement that didn't require emphasis to be true. "Ask me what you want to know." What followed was 2 hours of careful, methodical questioning. The agent asked. Daniel answered. He was precise about what he'd seen and when, consistent about the limits of his knowledge, honest about the moments when he'd been uncertain whether to proceed. He described the stairwell conversation in detail. He described the payphone call. He described the envelope slid under the door, the knock, Angela's voice from inside. At one point, the agent asked, "Did you at any point consider that what you were doing might be interfering with an ongoing investigation?" "There was no ongoing investigation when I started," Daniel said. "I had no way of knowing whether there would be one. I was trying to create the conditions for one. By feeding information to an external auditor. By feeding information to someone with the standing to act on it. Yes." The agent wrote something down. "And you never identified yourself or sought any kind of compensation or protection in exchange for the information?" "No." "Why not?" Daniel thought about it. The real answer, not the tidy one, the same way he'd answered Vivian Sterling's question. "Because the information wasn't mine to leverage," he said. "It belonged to the company, to the people whose jobs were about to be cut to cover up the theft. I was just the person who happened to be in the right place to see it." He paused. "Or the wrong place, depending on how you look at it." The agent looked at him for a moment, then wrote something else down. When it was over, the agent shook his hand and left. Carol Devereaux said something about follow-up documentation and left. Patricia Huang told him that the board had formally voted that morning to cancel the restructuring and that a company-wide communication confirming the reinstatement of all affected positions would go out by end of day. She said it to the room, but she was looking at him when she said it. Then it was Angela, and Patricia, and Vivian, and Daniel, and the room was quieter. "There's one more thing," Vivian said. She'd had her assistant prepare a folder. She slid it across the table to Daniel and let him open it himself. He opened it. "Read the first page." "Read it again." "That's a formal offer," Vivian said. "Director of Financial Integrity. It's a new role. We're creating it specifically. The mandate is internal audit oversight, compliance architecture, and a direct reporting line to the board's audit committee." She paused. "Not to the CFO." He kept his eyes on the page. The salary was on the second line of the first paragraph. He'd known what director-level compensation looked like from his auditing years, but seeing a specific number attached to his own name on an official offer letter produced a sensation he wasn't entirely prepared for. Not euphoria, more like the physical awareness of a door opening that had been closed for a very long time, the rush of air from somewhere better. He didn't let himself react to it visibly. He kept reading. "It's not charity," Vivian said, and her voice had an edge to it that he appreciated. Not defensive, just clear. "I don't do charity. This is a role the company needs that should have existed before, and you are currently the most qualified person I know to fill it. The fact that I'm finding that out under these particular circumstances is..." She stopped. "It's something I'm going to be thinking about for a long time." "It's a significant offer," he said. He was still looking at the page. "It's a fair offer. There's a difference." He looked up. "I need to think about it." Something flickered in her expression. Not irritation, more like respect, the particular kind that's produced by someone not doing what you expect. "Of course. Not because I'm not interested." He set the folder down but kept his hand on it. "Because I've been the night janitor on your 42nd floor for almost 3 years, And that's not a thing you just step sideways from without thinking about what it means, what it meant, what this means. He paused. Also, I need to talk to my daughter. Vivian blinked. Your daughter? She's 9. She has opinions about things. Angela, across the table, looked briefly like she was suppressing something. Take the week, Vivian said. Longer if you need it. I won't need longer than the week. Patricia cleared her throat gently. There's one additional element. Vivian wanted to address it personally, but given time constraints, she looked at Vivian. Vivian nodded. We're establishing a new internal program, employee recognition and advancement. The mandate is identifying staff across all levels of the company, not just professional tracks, not just degree holders, who have skills, backgrounds, or capabilities that are going underutilized in their current roles. She said it evenly, without ceremony. This didn't start as a symbolic gesture. It started as something that should have existed before because it makes operational sense. But the fact that the person who saved this company from losing $64 million was working a night cleaning shift while we spent his first maintenance request on the bottom of a pile. She stopped again. She seemed to do that at the moments when what needed to be said was large enough that ordinary language felt insufficient. It's a real program, Angela said, not a press release. No, Vivian agreed, not a press release. Daniel thought about the busted mop bucket wheel, about the second maintenance request that also went nowhere, about the 47th page of the legal pad in the cereal box, which was still in his work bag because he'd brought it in and forgotten to take it out. He thought about 8 years as a junior auditor going somewhere, and then the firm closing, and then the years that followed, the slow accumulation of smaller and smaller options until this job was the right size for what his life had become. He thought about the fact that he'd been good at the job. Not just the secret part of it, the actual job. He'd been good at the floors, good at the root, good at being present in spaces without disrupting them. He thought about what it meant that those two things, the auditor and the janitor, had coexisted inside the same person for 3 years without anyone around him seeing it. Not because they'd hidden it from them, because it had never occurred to anyone to look. I'll take the week, he said. He told Maya that evening. Not all of it. He'd decided some of the details could wait until she was older, until the federal case resolved and the whole thing had the settled quality of something past rather than something still moving. But the essential shape of it. He told her that he'd found out something wrong was happening at work, that he'd done what he could to fix it, and that because of that, they were offering him a different job. She was sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the third horse book, which she set down when he started talking and did not pick back up. She listened with the complete attention she gave to things that mattered, which was different from her ordinary attention in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. So you were like a detective, she said. Not exactly, more like a witness. What's the difference? He thought about it. A detective goes looking for things. A witness just happens to see them and then has to decide what to do about what they saw. She considered this. That sounds harder. It is, a little. Because you didn't choose it. Right. She picked up her book, set it back down. And the new job? You'd wear a suit? Probably not every day. But some days. Some days, yeah. She looked at the table for a moment with the expression she got when she was running something through whatever internal process she used for important decisions. I think you should take it, she said, but not just because of the suit. She paused. Because you were already doing the job. You were just doing it for free. He looked at her. 9 years old, arm hanging off the bed at night, horse books and grilled cheese on half days. The 7 with the little horizontal bar, her mother's handwriting living on in her hand. Yeah, he said. That's about right. She nodded, satisfied, and picked the book back up. He sat with his coffee and let the kitchen be what it was, small, warm, imperfect, with a bathroom cabinet that now had a fixed hinge and a refrigerator that still had the habit of running slightly loud, and thought about the offer letter in his bag, and about what the week would feel like, and about what Monday after that would feel like walking into that building in daylight, with a different badge and a different floor and a different chair to sit in. He didn't know exactly. He rarely knew things exactly. But he knew enough. He accepted on Thursday. He called Angela first because she'd been in it from the beginning in a way that felt worth acknowledging. She said good in the clipped, genuine way of someone who'd been waiting for the call and didn't need to perform relief about it. He called Patricia Huang's office and left a message with her assistant. Then he called the number on the offer letter, which turned out to go to Vivian Sterling's direct line, which he hadn't expected. She picked up herself. Mr. Mercer. Ms. Sterling, I'm calling to accept. A pause, brief and warm, in a way that her pauses sometimes were. I'm glad. I have one condition. Name it. The maintenance request backlog for the facilities staff. I'd like someone to actually work through it. He said it without heat, without agenda, just the practical clarity of someone who knows what gets overlooked and why. Not as a performance, as an actual operational correction. Silence on her end. Then, done. I'll have facilities management pull the full backlog by end of day. Thank you. Is there anything else? He thought about it. No, that's it. Then I'll see you Monday, Mr. Mercer. Monday, he said. He hung up. He was sitting at the kitchen table, afternoon light coming through the window, at the specific angle it came through in November, hitting the wall in a way that made the room look briefly like a different room. Warmer, slightly gold, the kind of light that shows up in photographs and makes ordinary places look like they meant something. He supposed ordinary places usually did mean something. People just had to be paying the right kind of attention. The federal case against Graham Holloway moved with the particular unhurried momentum of financial crimes prosecution, which is to say it moved slowly and then all at once. The initial charges were filed within the week. The asset recovery exceeded early estimates. $61 million ultimately returned to Sterling Dynamics over the following 8 months. Through a combination of frozen accounts, liquidated offshore holdings, and the cooperation of Curtis Ferris, who accepted a plea arrangement and provided testimony that significantly accelerated the timeline. Graham Holloway, who had maintained through his first 3 hearings that there had been a misunderstanding, stopped maintaining that after the 37 signed routing memos were entered into evidence. His attorney negotiated. The negotiation took 4 months. The outcome was a conviction on 11 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty, with a sentence that Holloway's legal team called disproportionate and that the prosecuting attorneys called the floor rather than the ceiling. He was not present in the courtroom for the reading of the verdict. He'd been present for the trial, but had looked, Daniel thought, like a man who had already been somewhere else for quite some time. Daniel read about the conviction on his phone during a lunch break. He was on the 23rd floor by then, in his own office, small, no particular view, but with a door that closed and a chair that wasn't a supply cart. And he read the article twice, set his phone face down, and finished his sandwich. He didn't feel triumphant. He'd expected to, had spent some time over the preceding months wondering if the absence of triumph said something unflattering about him. What he actually felt was more like the quiet completion of a thing that had been started a long time ago under very different circumstances, and had finally, at some cost, and with some luck, and with the help of people who'd been willing to take him seriously when they had no particular reason to, ended where it needed to end. That seemed like enough. In March, Sterling Dynamics held its first employee advancement showcase, the program Vivian had described in that Monday morning meeting, now operational, now real, now populated by 17 employees from across the company who'd been identified through the new internal review process as working significantly below their demonstrated capability levels. Daniel was not the one who ran the program. He'd been involved in designing its framework. He'd had opinions about what it should look like and how it should function, and Vivian had listened to those opinions with the specific attention she gave to things she intended to act on. But the operational lead was a woman from HR named Teresa Bowen, who had the particular combination of institutional knowledge and genuine enthusiasm that made programs like this work rather than merely exist. The showcase was held in the large conference room on 42, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the 40-person table where Daniel had once found a tablet in a chair and read a notification preview on its lock screen and kept moving. He stood at the back of the room and watched the presentations. A warehouse operations manager who had a degree in industrial engineering and had been requesting a transfer to process improvement for 2 years without response. A customer service representative who'd been quietly building automation tools in her spare time that were now being formally adopted by the tech team. a data entry specialist from the finance department who could read financial statements faster and more accurately than two of the analysts above him on the org chart. People who had been, in one way or another, invisible. Angela Reeves was there. She'd been retained for an ongoing compliance advisory role, which meant she was in the building more than she'd expected to be and had developed the habit of stopping by Daniel's office when she was on his floor. She came to stand beside him near the back of the room. "How does it feel?" she said quietly. He watched a woman named Keisha, the automation builder from customer service, walk through a demo of the tool she'd built, her voice steady and confident in the way of someone who has finally been asked to show what they can actually do. The room was paying attention, real attention. "Like something that should have been here a long time ago," he said. "Most good things are." He nodded. She was quiet for a moment, watching the presentation. Then, "You know Vivian's planning to mention you in the company annual report, by name." "I know, she asked me." "And?" "I said yes." He paused. "I spent 3 years not being mentioned. I figure I can handle being mentioned." Angela made a small sound that was the closest she usually got to a laugh. "How's Maya?" "On the 4th horse book, and she started asking about riding lessons." "Are you going to do it?" He thought about the cost of riding lessons, which he'd already looked up, and about the face Maya made when she talked about horses, which was the specific face of someone who hasn't yet learned to moderate their enthusiasm and hasn't been hurt by it yet. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "Good." The presentation ended. The room applauded. The genuine kind, the kind with actual energy in it. Keisha stepped back from the podium and looked briefly stunned, the way you look when you've been working towards something for so long that its arrival doesn't quite feel real. Daniel understood that. There is something particular about the kind of person who notices, who pays attention not because they're looking for advantage or recognition, but because the world has things in it that matter, and looking closely at them is just the honest way to move through it. It doesn't make you heroic. It doesn't make you exceptional. It makes you, at best, the kind of person who doesn't leave things worse than they found them. And at most, occasionally, the kind of person who finds something that needed finding. Daniel Mercer was not a complicated man. He would have told you that himself, without false modesty. He'd had a career, lost it, built something smaller, kept his daughter fed and warm, done his job well without credit, and happened to be in a room where something was wrong at a time when he still had the tools to understand what he was looking at. He'd done what those tools allowed him to do. That was the full extent of it. What was more complicated, and what he thought about sometimes, on the bus home, or in the particular quiet of a late afternoon in his office when the city outside the window was doing its city things, was what it meant that so many people like him existed in so many buildings, running so many routes, doing jobs that no one filmed and no one applauded, while carrying inside them whole professional lives, whole lost careers, whole bodies of knowledge that no one in those buildings had ever thought to ask about. It wasn't a comforting thought, exactly, but it was an honest one, and he had always found honesty more useful than comfort. He took the 5:40 bus home most evenings now, which got him to his stop at 6:12 if the connections worked. He picked Maya up from Mrs. Okafor's on Tuesdays and Thursdays when her after-school program ran late. They made dinner together, still macaroni sometimes, still grilled cheese on days that called for it, and she read her horse books and he read things on his phone or just sat in the kitchen with his coffee and let the evening be what it was. One night in April, she looked up from her book and said, without any particular preamble, "Dad, do you think people can tell by looking at you what you can do?" He thought about it. The real answer: no. "No," he said, "usually not." "That seems like a problem." "It is," he said, "but it can also be useful." She looked at him with the evaluating expression. "Useful how?" He thought about the 42nd floor at 11 o'clock at night, the busted wheel on the mop bucket squealing down the corridor, the shredded paper on the polished concrete floor, and the particular shape of numbers even when cut into strips, and the way a pattern reassembles itself when you know what you're looking at. "Because," he said, "if no one's watching what you can do it without anyone getting in the way." She considered this for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, with the serious deliberateness of a child writing something down in a place she intended to keep. "Okay," she said, and went back to her book. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator ran its familiar sound. Outside, the city moved through its evening in the ordinary, indifferent, entirely human way that cities move, full of people doing their jobs and their lives and their quiet, unwitnessed acts of competence and care, most of which would never be seen, and some of which, once in a while, turned out to matter more than anyone had thought to expect. Daniel finished his coffee, put the mug in the sink, stood at the window for a moment the way he sometimes did. Then he turned around and asked his daughter if she wanted more macaroni. She did. The writing lessons started in May. Daniel had found a stable 40 minutes outside the city by train. Not cheap, but not unreasonable either, which was a calculation he was still getting used to making on a different set of numbers than the ones he'd been working with for the past 3 years. The instructor was a woman in her 50s named Carol, who had the weathered, no-nonsense quality of someone who'd spent 30 years around animals and had stopped performing patience because actual patience had replaced it entirely. Maya was terrified the first session. She didn't say so, but Daniel could read her the way he could read most things he'd spent enough time paying attention to. The set of her shoulders, the way she held her hands slightly too still at her sides, the careful way she approached the horse they'd assigned her. A gray mare named Duchess, who was apparently chosen for beginners because she was, in Carol's words, too tired to be unpredictable. "You can pet her," Carol said. Maya reached out, touched the horse's neck with 2 fingers, pulled her hand back. "She's warm," she said, surprised. "Animals usually are," Carol said, without making it a lesson. Maya reached out again. This time she left her hand there. Daniel stood at the fence and watched his daughter's shoulders slowly drop from where they'd been, up near her ears, down to where they normally lived. It took about 4 minutes. He timed it without meaning to, which was a habit he suspected he'd never fully lose. On the train home, she talked the entire 40 minutes. Not about being scared, which she wouldn't acknowledge until months later in the offhand way she sometimes circled back to things. About Duchess specifically. The way she'd smelled, the sound her hooves made on the stable floor, the particular expression she'd made when Maya had offered her the small piece of carrot Carol had provided. Maya described the carrot transaction with the forensic detail of a witness giving testimony, and Daniel listened and asked the right questions, and thought about how the specific joy of a child discovering something they love is one of the few things in adult life that still arrives completely unmediated, without the buffer of expectation or the weight of history. He thought, her mother would have loved this. He let the thought sit for a moment and then let it go, the way he'd learned to do, not suppressing it, not dwelling in it, just acknowledging it the way you acknowledge weather. It was there. It was real. And the train was moving, and Maya was talking, and the city was coming back into view through the window, and life was doing what it did. In June, Angela Reeves called with news about the Ferris sentencing. Curtis Ferris had received 38 months, reduced from the original recommendation in exchange for his cooperation, which had been extensive and had ultimately provided the thread that unraveled the Cayman account structure faster than the federal team had anticipated. The additional recovery from those accounts brought the total return to Sterling Dynamics to just over $63 million, within 4% of Angela's original conservative estimate, which she mentioned with a dryness that Daniel appreciated. "Not bad for a guess," he said. "It wasn't a guess," she said. "It was a floor with appropriate epistemic humility." "Right. How's the program?" He leaned back in his chair. Through his office window, he could see a narrow slice of the street below, people moving in the June warmth with the particular looseness that good weather produces in Chicago, as if the whole city had briefly unclenched. "Teresa's expanded it. We've got 23 participants in the second cohort. 3 of them are already in formal transfer processes to roles that match their actual backgrounds." "And the warehouse engineer?" "Promoted 2 months ago. He's running a process improvement initiative for the distribution centers. Already identified a routing inefficiency that's going to save the company about $800,000 annually." Daniel paused. He'd been in that warehouse for 6 years. 6 years, Angela repeated. He'd submitted a transfer request twice. Both times it went to a manager who didn't forward it. The silence between them had the quality of 2 people who didn't need to say what the silence was about, because they'd both spent enough time inside systems that worked this way to understand it without elaboration. "Well," Angela said finally. "Yeah," Daniel said. After they hung up, he sat for a while with his hands on the desk, not working, just sitting. This was something he'd given himself permission to do occasionally. Just sit, without the productive forward motion that had been his default for most of his professional life. His therapist, whom he'd started seeing in February at the low-key suggestion of a company wellness program he'd have dismissed out of hand 3 years ago, called it integration. He called it sitting. Either way, it helped. He thought about the 6 years the warehouse manager had spent in the wrong place. He thought about his own 3 years. He thought about Keisha from customer service, about the data entry specialist who read financial statements faster than the analysts above him, about all the floors and all the buildings and all the cities where someone was pushing a cart or answering phones or entering data while carrying inside them a whole other version of their working life that no one had thought to ask about. He didn't have a solution to that. He had a program at one company in one city, which was not nothing, but was also not a solution. The gap between not nothing and a solution was large enough to be humbling, and he decided that humility about the size of the gap was more useful than either despair about it or false satisfaction with the partial. You do what's in your reach. You do it carefully. You try to make sure it actually works rather than just looking like it works. And you stay honest about what it is and what it isn't. That was about all he had. It was, he'd concluded, enough to operate on. Sandra left Sterling Dynamics in July. Not under any cloud. She'd had nothing to do with the fraud, had known nothing, had been as deceived as anyone by the man she'd organized the days of for 11 years. She left because, she told the HR team, she needed to work somewhere that didn't remind her every day of how much she'd trusted something that turned out to be hollow. Daniel heard about her departure through the ordinary channels of office information and thought about it briefly and genuinely wished her well, which was uncomplicated. She had always been decent to him, within the limits of what she'd been able to see. The new executive assistant on 42 was a younger man named Jerome, who had an organizational precision that bordered on art, and who, Daniel noted, responded to maintenance requests within 24 hours because he'd apparently decided that was simply what you did. The mop bucket wheel had been fixed in the first week of December, 2 days after Vivian had promised it. Daniel had looked at it on his last night shift, before the transition to the new role, before Monday morning in Conference Room B, before any of what followed, and felt something that was close to fondness, which was not the emotion he'd expected to feel about a mop bucket, and which he'd decided said more about attachment to the texture of difficult periods than about the bucket itself. He'd left it in the supply closet, somebody else's route now. The annual report came out in August. Daniel's name appeared in it on page 12, in the section Vivian had titled simply, "This Year's Foundation," which described the internal investigation, the recovery, the employee advancement program, and in 3 precise paragraphs that Daniel had approved after suggesting 2 edits. The account of how it had started, his name, his role at the time, his background, the 3 years. He read it at his desk on a Thursday morning, the way you read things about yourself, with a slight detachment, as if the person on the page is someone you know well but are not entirely identical to. The prose was factual and unembellished, which was what he'd asked for. No language about heroism, no language about the overlooked man rising to the occasion. Just what had happened, stated cleanly, with enough detail to be true and enough restraint to be dignified. He thought Vivian had probably written it herself. It had her quality, precise where it needed to be precise, and quiet where lesser writers would have reached for something larger. He sent her an email. 2 sentences. I read page 12. Thank you for getting it right. She replied 20 minutes later, which for Vivian Sterling was essentially immediate. Thank you for giving me something worth getting right. He printed the email, folded it, put it in the top drawer of his desk, which was where he kept the small number of things he wanted to be able to find again. Maya's last school photo. A note she'd written him in February that said, "You are a good dad, and also pretty smart for someone who didn't know what a canter was." A business card Angela had given him on that first night in the doorway of the temporary office, which he'd held on to for reasons he hadn't entirely examined. He added the email, closed the drawer. On a Friday evening in September, Daniel stood on the 42nd floor for the first time since his last night shift. He was there because Vivian had asked him to sit in on a board meeting that included a presentation of the first-year results from the Employee Advancement Program, and the board met on 42, in the large conference room with the floor-to-ceiling windows. He arrived early, which was his nature, and stood in the corridor for a moment before going in. The floor was different in the early evening. The day shift thinning out, the quality of light changed, the particular quietness of a large office settling into its after-hours self. He recognized the sounds. The ventilation system's low register, the elevator chime down the hall, the small ambient noise of a building that doesn't fully stop. He walked slowly down the east corridor, not going anywhere specific, just walking it. The executive's suite was mostly dark. Holloway's old office had been reassigned. A new CFO, a woman named Dr. Rita Sharma, who had come from outside and who had, in Daniel's limited interactions with her, the specific quality of someone who understood that her predecessor's example was both a warning and a baseline she intended to exceed. The office looked different with her things in it, lighter, somehow. He walked past the supply closet, past the alcove beside the east stairwell door where he'd spent his smoke breaks for 3 years, not smoking, sitting on an overturned bucket with his phone and his thoughts, building the picture piece by piece in the 30-minute window when nobody walked past. He stopped there for a moment. The alcove was just an alcove, a small recession in the wall, functional, entirely unremarkable. Nothing marked it, nothing would. I thought about what it felt like to sit there night after night with something enormous taking shape in his understanding, with no certainty that it would ever become anything more than his own private knowledge. He thought about the specific loneliness of that, not self-pity, just the accurate description of what it had been. You do something difficult and invisible, and the invisibility is the condition of its being possible, and you understand that, and you do it anyway, and you accept that it may never be otherwise. And then, sometimes, it becomes otherwise. He stood in the alcove for another moment. Then he straightened, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the conference room to present before the board. The presentation went well. Teresa ran the numbers. Daniel provided context. Vivian asked sharp questions and nodded at the answers, and the board approved the program's continuation and expanded budget with the kind of institutional decisiveness that, Daniel had learned, was what governance looked like when it was actually functioning. Not smooth, not ceremonial, just people with the right information making the right call. Afterward, in the elevator going down, Patricia Huang stood beside him and said, without looking at him, in the idle tone of an observation rather than a question, "You're good in there." In the elevator? She almost smiled. In the boardroom. He looked at the floor numbers counting down. "I know what I'm talking about," he said. "That makes most things easier." She nodded. The elevator reached the lobby. They went their separate ways. He walked out through the revolving door into the September evening, which was the best kind of Chicago evening. Cool without being cold, the light still holding in the western sky. The city and the specific key it hit in early fall before the lake took over. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it be what it was. He thought about calling Maya, then decided he'd just be home in 40 minutes and tell her in person whatever was worth telling, which was probably not very much. The board had approved the program. He'd walked the east corridor one more time. The city looked like itself in September. He started walking toward the train. Behind him, the Sterling Dynamics building rose 42 floors into the early evening sky, lit from within, full of people finishing their days and heading toward their lives. Most of them unknown to each other in the way that people in large institutions are mostly unknown to each other. Each one carrying something, each one moving through their hours with whatever they had. The seen and the unseen existing side by side in the ordinary, unremarkable, quietly essential way they always do. He didn't look back. He had a train to catch, and a daughter to get home to, and a life that was, against several odds and through no small amount of stubbornness and patience, and the willingness to trust that what you know has value, even when no one around you knows that you know it. Finally, imperfectly, and without ceremony,